Did you see the shocking images of the ancient ruins of some square structure on Mars? Are we seeing the remains of a long-lost alien civilization? Chris Ramsey shared the exciting news. Photo from a square structure on Mars posted to Reddit. It is indeed real. This image originates from the Mars Global Surveyor's Mars Orbiter camera. The original image can be viewed through Arizona State University's Mars Image Explorer. Joe Rogan's mind was blown. He said, "This is wild." Elon replied, "We should send astronauts to Mars to investigate." Desert Ranger adds, "Perhaps the most interesting thing about this structure is that it sits on the top edge of a crater. Perhaps the site was bombed and the foundation is intact because the building was far from the ground zero. What was this structure, and what kind of explosion could have destroyed a building so far from ground zero?" And we have no such thing as a perfect 90-degree angel in nature. This is fascinating. There are no squares in nature. Only people, thus far, create squares. Have there been beings older than us from Mars? Humans invented squares. Before we were there, they did not exist, as it was literally impossible for a square to form without human interaction. Aliens. But there's a community note that says, context. Both of these images were edited to make the square shape clearer. The original can be seen here. So, here are the two images that were circulated. The one on the right was clearly edited. It's got some digital lines on it. But the one on the left was edited as well, mainly by adjusting the contrast and such to emphasize the square. Here's the original image. You can still make out a square shape. And here it is on ASU's Mars Orbiter Camera Image Explorer. Now, if you're around my age, you probably remember something very similar when you were growing up in the 1980s. Because back in the 80s, we were shown a photograph of a mysterious face on Mars. The photo was taken in 1976. Imagine taking a photo of Mars and you see an enormous face staring right back at you. This, we were told, suggests that there was once life on Mars, for this face must be the result of intelligence. Unfortunately for the alien hunters, higher resolution photos were taken in 1998 and 2001, and it turns out that the face didn't look like a face at all. But here's what I find interesting about all of this. If we see a mountain on Mars that looks vaguely like a face when the shadows are just right, we start talking about aliens. We associate the structure of a face with intelligent design. And the more it looks like a face, the more we'll think it must have been designed. People stopped talking about the Mars face when better images showed that it doesn't actually look like a face. If better images had shown that it looks even more like a face than we realized from the 1976 image, we would have been more impressed, and people would have become more convinced that the face was made by an intelligent designer. But here we are on planet Earth, and we see faces all around us every day, real faces. And we're told that only stupid people think that these faces were ultimately the work of an intelligent designer. When we see something on Mars that looks vaguely like a square, we start talking about intelligence. But here's a composite electron micrograph of part of the motor in a bacterial flagellum. These are parts of bacteria. And we're told that only stupid people think these structures were ultimately the work of an intelligent designer. Think about this as you're watching this video right now. How many things that you see on your screen right now don't require a creator? The books? Someone definitely had to make them. The shelves? Someone had to make them. The Syd Barrett painting? Obviously had a creator. The little wooden ark model that came in my Artsa box? Had to be made. My glasses, my shirt, my necklace, my watch, my ring, all obviously and indisputably made. There's a fake plant right beside me. Oddly enough, if I tell you the plant is fake, you'll conclude that someone made it. If I tell you the plant is real, many of you will conclude that no one made it, even though a real plant is massively more complicated than a fake plant. So, since this plant is fake, what's the only thing you see in this video that we're assured wasn't created? Me, a human being, far more complicated than everything else you see right now combined, and that's including whatever device you're using to watch this video. Anything you see on your screen right now, apart from me, is a joke compared to any living thing. The simplest living cell is more sophisticated than 1,000 squares on Mars. So, why do people start inferring design when they see a rough outline of a square on Mars, but we're told only morons would infer design when we examine the most sophisticated things we know about in the entire universe? Two main reasons. First, years ago, we were told by smart people in positions of authority over us that smart people had figured out that life wasn't created. And we believed these people because they knew way more than us back then. By the time we could read and study and examine the evidence for ourselves, we'd already been programmed not to see design when it was staring us right in our faces far more than the imaginary Mars face ever stared at us. Second, we're just really familiar with the things we see around us. We're used to them. We're not used to squares or faces on Mars, so we find them surprising. But we're used to things on Earth, so they're not surprising. And since they're not surprising, we're not as desperate to find explanations. But did you know that if you deprive your senses of things for a while, they'll eventually become surprising again? It happened to me 30 years ago. Here's a fun story you've never heard. In 1995, I was convicted of malicious wounding. And when you're convicted, they put you in a holding cell with other inmates for processing. They have to figure out what to do with you in the jail before they send you off to prison. So, a lady comes to the bars of the cell and starts asking questions. Now, before she got there, I was on a roll telling stories to the 4 or 5 other guys in that holding cell. I don't remember what I was talking about, but they were cracking up. Then the lady comes to the bars and has some questions for me because she knows I've been in a mental hospital. So she asks why I was in a mental hospital. What was I diagnosed with? And the entire time I'm answering these questions, the guys behind me are giggling like, oh man, this guy's nuts. Then the lady asks, have you ever attempted... She wanted to know if I'd ever tried to end myself. And I say, have I? I hadn't, but for some reason, I liked giving people at the jail incorrect information. What were they going to do? Lock me up? So she becomes more concerned and says, how did you go about attempting that? And I say, I jumped off a bridge. Again, I didn't. It was actually my brother's dad who jumped off a bridge, and he died. But the story was still fresh in my mind, so I used it. I said, I jumped off a bridge. She replied, and what happened? And I said, I guess I survived, obviously. The guys behind me were almost falling off their benches listening to this. Long story short, the guards put me in isolation with nothing but a paper gown and a roll of toilet paper. They knew I'd be going to a mental hospital to see if I should be in jail or in a mental hospital, so they decided they'd just keep me in isolation until I was evaluated. So I spent about 3 months in isolation. They'd let me out a couple of times per week to take a shower. The shower was right beside my cell. So I'm seeing very little of anything for months. On a side note, I've been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. I'm considered more mentally tough than normal people. Things that affect normal people don't affect me nearly as much. But I can tell you, if you spend months in isolation, you start losing your mind. I went on this brief tangent to help you understand how they're trying to break Tommy in the UK. I can guarantee you he's losing his mind right now. But after a few months, they told me they were taking me to Central State Psychiatric Hospital. They put me in shackles. All I had seen for months was wall, 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 bars, and on the other side of the bars, wall. And suddenly, I was in a police van, and I got to see the world again for the first time. Everything was amazing. The sun, the sky, clouds, trees, stop signs, sidewalks, people, bridges. It was all new to me, and I was astonished at everything. About 6 months later, I was in the same isolation cell once again, this time because I wasn't eating. I wasn't eating because I was trying to outfast this Christian. But the psychiatrist thought I was trying to starve myself to death, and yet again, I had no desire to give her accurate information. I'd been in the cell for a while. Wall, 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 bars. This time, however, I didn't need to see the sun, the sky, clouds, or anything beyond my cell. I didn't need trees or flowers to be amazed. Everything became amazing. The walls, the bars, my bunk, hands, eyes, everything. I realized that there's more to the world than my atheism could account for. If you don't know what happened next, you can watch my video, How God Destroyed My Atheism. But it took being completely stripped away from life as usual to undo the programming I'd received all my life. You're made to recognize design. You're made to recognize the signs of your Creator. For some reason, you turn it on when you see something that looks like a face on Mars. But you spend your entire life being trained to turn it off when you see a real face on Earth. Don't let anyone rob you of one of your greatest and most important abilities.